Well, hey, Canvas Church, this is Pastor Mike back with another edition of Midweek Thoughts. And for this thought, I thought I'd bring in the heavyweight, and I mean that
Watching your term on
intellectually.
heavy there.
I mean that intellectually,
Thanks.
but grateful for technology and able to video in my father, Richard Blackaby. Many of you have met him. He's come and he's spoken and taught at our Sunday gatherings before. And so all the way from south of Atlanta, Georgia, welcome Dr. Richard Blackaby.
That's good to be with you. I wish I could beam myself up there in person, see those grandkids.
Yeah, well, they're definitely grateful to have a backyard, and so are we at this time. And so I've been putting some videos out in the middle of the week, just oftentimes just sort of things I'm thinking of or things that I've recently read, and was chatting with you a little bit, and would love for you to share some thoughts with those who watch this video, specifically on this question. Uh, Sometimes when tough times hit us, which obviously right now is one of those times, um, throughout history, though, uh, the tendency is to assume that somehow God is far removed when there's tough times, and that maybe he's distant or he's not there. And people can often ask, where is God during these difficult moments? But throughout history, maybe hindsight is 2020, but when we look back throughout history, we can see that sometimes God does some of his greatest works in some of the most difficult times. And so why don't you share, as the resident historian here, why don't you share a little bit about throughout history, how has God often revealed himself in the times where he might seem the most distant?
Well, that's a great question, and that's where history can be such a help. It was Winston Churchill who said of Hitler in World War II, he said if Hitler would just read history, he'd know what his future was. And sure enough, just like Napoleon and others, what had happened in history before happened to Hitler. And so when you're trying to discern the present, it oftentimes helps to look and see, well, how has God done this before? Because God's been at this a long time. And sometimes when we're looking forward, it's confusing, but you look back and you realize, oh, sure enough, God was there. God was at work the whole time. One example that I'm always thinking of is a man named Jeremiah Lamphere. September 23rd, he was in Manhattan, and he just, God put this burden on his heart that he should try to reach out to business people in New York. And so he's trying to reach them and trying to have Bible studies. Nothing's working. Finally, September 23rd, he says, we're going to have a prayer meeting at noon. He starts it. Nobody shows up. He's about halfway through the lunch hour before he finally gets one person that comes. By the end of the hour, there's been 6 people gathered. Next week, there's a few more. But then at the same time, there's a huge financial crisis. It strikes America. In fact, at that time, it was the biggest financial panic that America had ever faced. All of a sudden, the banks are in distress. People are losing their jobs. People are losing all their businesses. People are committing suicide. It's disastrous. There's a whole shipment of gold being sent on a boat from San Francisco to New York to try to stabilize things. And a huge storm strikes and sinks the boat with all kinds of gold that was going to settle the crisis. Just one crisis after another, just bad news after bad news. And people are like, where is a loving God in all this? People are losing their jobs and their businesses, and people are going down in ship storms. And God, where are you? Well, what people don't notice at first is that when the crisis hits, people start showing up at Lamphere's prayer meetings, and eventually over 10,000 people are meeting to pray every noon hour, 5 days a week in Manhattan. The revival spreads all over America, and within 1 year, 1 million people are converted and added to the church in a country of 30 million people at the time. It's enormous. By the end of 1859, over 1 million people added to the churches. Well, when you watch history, you realize, oh, God used a crisis and he reached 1 million people for Christ in a year. Wow, it's amazing what God did. Keep going through history, though. And only a year and a half later, the American Civil War breaks out. 550,000 young men die on the battlefields and in battle related issues. Many of those, tens of thousands of those men who died on the battlefields, had been converted just a year and a half earlier in that Great Awakening. Now you look back and you say, why was God so insistent? Why was he pressuring Namfir, get out there and get this revival started? Because God knew that 550,000 men would die in just 2 years from that. And God knew the urgency. And so throughout history, you'll see this, where when God begins to stir, sometimes it's a crisis that happens first and that brings revival. Sometimes revival comes and then a crisis comes. If you studied in East Africa, there was a great revival that took place beginning in Rwanda and then spreading all over East Africa. And I remember in the 1980s, people sending out requests. We need more missionaries. The people are responding by the thousands, and and there was a great movement of God. We're all excited about the mission work going on there. Then 1994 comes, and there's a huge genocide that takes place in Rwanda. They say maybe over 800,000 people are murdered within a few months. My dad and mom went over there right after that, and they talked to missionaries and pastors who said, we saw entire churches floating down the rivers, hacked to death by machetes. And this revival that came and swept in thousands and thousands of converts, God knew that soon many of those people would be entering into eternity. And so what I've learned is whenever I see a crisis of any kind, I'm always asking, now God is not caught by surprise. What does God know that we don't know? Does God know a bunch of these people may be coming to the end of their lives shortly, or some crisis will happen and we're not ready for it yet? Looking back later, you realize, oh, that's why God was doing that. Doors opened up. And of course, with this pandemic, Mike, so many churches are changing the way they do things. I saw a statistic from one church that said they had over, I think, 100 times as many people watching their Easter service as would normally attend in person.
Mm.
And they were saying, we've never had so many people hear the gospel as since this pandemic. And so God always knows, God never wastes a crisis.
Mhm.
And God has a way of taking crises and doing work that was not happening before the crisis.
And I know some people may be quick to try and attribute the crisis itself to God and say, well, maybe God is causing this in order to bring about these good ends, and that's a tricky thing that I'm always hesitant to go there, because it's hard to tell, and we can't really know. Is God, causing something? Is he allowing it to happen? Like that tricky middle ground there. But what can be sure is that these things don't catch God off guard. And
Right.
like you said, he doesn't waste a crisis. And so I keep thinking, God is always at work, and that truth just seems to be magnified sometimes when a
Wow.
crisis hits, because it might be that when a crisis hits, we start looking for the activity of God more so than we normally do. And so I sort of hope too that because of this crisis, that when we come out on the other side, we don't necessarily just go back to business as usual, but we say, hey, my eyes were open to see where the activity of God was during this time. May my eyes continue to be open even on the
Yeah.
other side of this, because God doesn't just start working in a crisis, and he doesn't just stop working after the crisis ends. He's working all the way through.
Yeah.
And so my question for myself and for those who are watching is, do we have the eyes to see the activity of God and to join the activity of God? Because it seems like these moments of history seem to just put a magnifying glass up to
Yeah.
right up to our situation, and maybe people are a bit more spiritually sensitive towards the activity of God, in the same way that we're sensitive towards many other things when a crisis hits. And
Well,
so it's
we're
fascinating to look through history to see that happen.
historically, we don't handle prosperity well. If you study the Old Testament, whenever God blessed his people Israel, they always forsook him and they began to love their money and their blessings instead of the blesser. And so periodically, God would say, I'll send a drought, I'll send enemies. Sometimes God would be very directly involved. Other times, God would just take his hand of protection away and just let it happen. He just wouldn't intervene to stop it. And so he allowed it. Either way, he was going to use it. And what I've discovered is there are things God can do when he blesses us. And North America has experienced lots of blessing. But there's other things that God does best in times of crisis. He gets our attention. It's kind of the way as C.S. Lewis said. It's his megaphone sometimes, where he raises his voice. And there's things that only happen in a crisis. And I think over the course of a life, personally, and over the course of a nation, God's going to use both. God will do all he can with blessing. That's his preference. If he could bless us and every person in Canada and America would love him, then that's what he would do all the time. But sometimes it's a crisis that gets our attention. And so God will periodically make use of those as well. And yeah, you're right. There's no point unless God's given you a direct word of revelation that this is from him. You waste a lot of time speculating. Did he send it? Did he allow it? Whatever. Will he use it? Yeah, 100%. You can be sure of that.
Well, I appreciate you giving some thoughts. We're gonna wrap this up to keep within our time limit here, but let's do this again. And
Yeah,
grateful for technology to be able to connect from really from the northwest of Canada to the southeast of the United States. And so thanks again. And Canvas Church, remember this week that you are loved both by God and by your church family. And so keep your head up and keep your eyes open because God is at work, even in the midst of those times that maybe seem the darkest.